Okay. Okay, well, tonight is the final ending of the second quarter, where we've been talking about everything that happened once we basically got down to Detroit, and starting with Nicholas and working our way from there. We're ending up this quarter with Pontiac and everything that had happened with Pontiac. And why in the world would we be talking about Pontiac, he's obviously not a Huron Wyandotte, he's Ottawa. Why is Pontiac of any interest to us when we talk about our history, our traditions, and everything that's relevant to who we are? Does anybody know why Pontiac's uprising is so important to our history? Anybody want to take a guess? Well, after everything happened with Pontiac's uprising, there was a significant shift in the politics that was taking place among the tribes, especially with the relationship with the British. And after Pontiac, there was a major shift with everything that took place. And when we get down to the way in which all of this plays out, once the uprising had pretty much ceased, we'll see where that shift of power took place within the Ohio country. And I'm sure everybody can probably take a pretty good guess as to where that shift of power ended up going to. So tonight our objectives is we're going to do a review of the events. We're going to take a look at the carnage and then the aftermath. So with Pontiac, we saw last month that he was a very powerful chief. He was also a very bully of a chief. He kind of got what his want, not so much through his political prowess and his diplomacy and his ability to sit down and negotiate and work things out with his friends and his allies. He basically walked up and was a bully. He told people what he wanted, and he got it because he made threats, and he just pushed people around. And it's pretty easy for somebody like Pontiac to get what he wants, especially if he's got the power of his warriors back at him, and he's just a bully. And the grandmas and grandpas, they had a problem with the Ottawa tribe going all the way back to not but just a few years after the dispersal from our homeland. We basically were kind of at the mercy of the Ottawa. We had lost a tremendous amount of our warriors and our people because of dispersal, and the Ottawa kind of took us in and introduced us to the nations out west, the Potawatomi and the Chippewa. And we basically, to a degree, became almost vassals of the Ottawa tribe. And we've talked a couple of times throughout the last couple of months how we rebelled against that control that they had. And here we are now in 1763, and most of the Huron Wyandotte people were very, very, very much in a sense of utter distrust of the Ottawa people. Too much had happened, and we can see that there's some issues with some of our people wanting to actually side with him during the uprising. And that's very clear with the two different factions that we saw last week in Detroit. We had Decay and Tieta. One was supportive of Pontiac, the other one was not. And we also had down in Sandusky, the Wyandotte, who was very supportive of Pontiac because of some obvious reasons when the Europeans started putting pressure on their claimed land. But a lot of people have a tendency to believe that the opposition that Tieta had against Pontiac was because he had some feelings, some sentiments, very like what we saw with the Baron a couple of months back. He is assumed to have been very supportive of the British and the Haudenosaunee, but that's not actually the reason why he was opposed to Pontiac. Tieta was actually very supportive of the Catholic Church. He didn't want to fight because he had kind of changed his ways. He was Huron through and through, and he had that temper and he had that cunning about him, but he was also very dedicated to the church. And he wasn't going to actually support Pontiac and go to war unless Father Pontiac basically gave him the blessing. And he held out for the longest time. And then he finally got the blessing of the church to go to war. And that's about the same time that the pressure was being put on him by Pontiac. So he consented and decided to bring his band into the fold. That way, all the Huron Wyandotte had basically aligned with Pontiac. So the British settlers were putting a lot of pressure on the claimed land on the Sandusky, and the Wyandotte were extremely willing to go ahead and side with Pontiac because they were not going to lose the land. They were getting very vocal in their opposition, and Pontiac had a very strong ally with the Huron Wyandotte that were living down the Sandusky. And about this same time, we're starting to see where the differences in the opinions and the viewpoints between the Huron in Detroit and the Wyandotte down the Sandusky were starting to get very, very clear. They weren't opposing each other, but they had kind of different political viewpoints that they were pursuing. One of them was their allies with the British. Initially, if you can remember, the Wyandotte had reached out and tried to make contact with the Pennsylvanians. They did that with Nicholas, and they were very supportive of the British until they found out that they were all about the land. They weren't about the people, they weren't about the tribes, they were about the land, taking it as much as they could. And even the Royal Proclamation of 1763, and the map here with the red going down, basically the divide of the Appalachian Mountains, is what the king basically said was the dividing line between the colonies and the Indians. And that didn't even persuade our grandmas and grandpas to give up and basically say, okay, we'll be friends with the British. It wasn't enough. So the Royal Proclamation of 1763 was destined to fail because all of the colonists wanted the land out to the west, and they weren't going to basically honor this invisible line because nobody really knew where it was. They weren't going to honor it. They wanted the land, and they were still pushing more and more to the west. And the Wyandotte became more and more vocal about their opposition to the European encroachment. And by ancient default and by heritage of the tribes, the Wyandotte began to slowly emerge more and more and more as a recognized leader, especially with the tribes that still resided more to the east, to the eastern side of the Ohio country. By this time, Pontiac had woven that really tight network of the tribes. The Ottawa had a strong influence of everything to the west, and the Wyandotte became more and more influential over the tribes that were residing in the east. So we see this shift of power already taking place even before the uprising began. The Ottawa retained that authority over the whole of this campaign, but more and more and more of what was taking place to the east was influenced by the Wyandotte. And the whole engagement, the whole uprising was set to happen with the sign of the moon in May. All of the tribes had basically agreed that they would strike at a certain time depending upon the moon. But unfortunately, in order for all the communication to be done, they were distributing wampum belts back and forth with the Ottawa to the other nations. The wampum belts were those agreements that everybody would side with Pontiac and the Ottawa, and they would do as they had basically said that they would. They were delivering messages and communicating back and forth with wampum belts when one of them was intercepted. The wampum belt that was being sent to the Miami at Fort Miami got intercepted in March of 1763. And the whole uprising had been found out. The commander at Fort Miami did an official report. He sent the report to Major Henry Gladwin, who was the commander of Fort Detroit. Gladwin went ahead and sent his report on up the food chain to his superiors, and the rebellion was dismissed as being just, it was a myth. There's no way that the British thought that the Indians could do an uprising. They thought that the communication that they intercepted was basically a forgery, and everything was put to the side. They didn't make any plans for anything that could have been reported in that original intercept in March. Then in May, on May 6th, 1763, Major Glanwin was informed of this impending uprising. This rebellion was brought to his attention by his Ojibwe mistress. And when she said that Pontiac was planning this and he was going to do that, since she was an Indian herself, he actually believed her. And fortunately for the British, if you want to say fortunately, this was the day before Pontiac walked into Detroit. Pontiac, on the following day, on May 7th, that was the day that he had designated as the attack. That was when he was going to walk through the front doors of Detroit. He had with him 300 of his warriors, and it would have been a little awkward to be looking down across the grounds and see Pontiac walking in with 300 warriors. That just didn't happen every single day. So he was expecting to just walk in there and just deliver a lot of carnage to all the people that were residing in the fort. But unfortunately, when he walked through those front doors, everybody was waiting. The major basically had up to about 12, maybe 16 hours to get everything ready. And he had all of his troops, he had all of the settlers, as many people as he could arm with rifles and bayonets. He had them waiting. So Pontiac walked into the front door of Fort Detroit, completely unaware that he had been discovered. He spoke a few words when he walked into the rifle barrels. He turned around, and with his 300 warriors, he just casually walked back out the front of the fort like, hey, nothing's going on. It's just another day. And the British let him do it. He walked in, he turned around, he walked out, and just basically acted as though nothing had happened. So Pontiac returned on May 9th. He returned. The British weren't really expecting him to come back in 2 days, but he returned and they would not let him enter the fort. So Pontiac basically laid siege to the fort. He had hoped to walk into the fort and kill every single one of the individuals that were actually inside the walls. That was his plan. It got foiled, so he laid siege. And this is a really good painting by Frederick Remington that is entitled The Siege of Fort Detroit. And it can kind of give you the idea of what was going on, how the fort was protected with a palisade. You had all the tribes that were outside the fort, basically just shooting volley after volley after volley into the stockade, throwing fire in, doing everything that they could to burn out the British, but more importantly, they were trying to starve them to death. But unfortunately for the Indians, the backside of the fort was right adjacent to the river, the strait there. So they were able from time to time to smuggle some foods and supplies into the fort, so they were not completely starved out as what Pontiac had hoped. The participating tribes in this little uprising, this is the primary tribes that were supporting Pontiac in the Ottawa. To the western side of the country, the Ottawa had basically taken command of the nations that you see here. I'm not going to take the time to read all the names. And then to the east, the Huron-Wyandotte had taken command of the other nations. The Cherokee and the Catawba, they also were participants in Pontiac's uprising. They basically did their own thing, more down to the south east portion of the colonies. They didn't really participate in what the Ottawa and the Huron-Wyandotte and Pontiac was doing. They did their own thing. Pontiac's plan to eliminate Fort Detroit had been completely spoiled. But the campaign that he had put into play against the British was fully underway, and there was really no way that it could be stopped. Everybody was basically doing their own thing, and it was unstoppable. Pontiac may have been a bully. He may have been that bad person walking on the backside of the schoolyard, pushing people around. But what he had done when everything came into full play was absolutely brilliant. He was a strategist at that time that nobody could really compare to. Pontiac, unfortunately for him to put together the plans that every single one of the nations were enacting, and every one of the forts that he was attacking couldn't develop a plan 100% on his own. So even though he was a brilliant strategist, he was dependent upon each of the participating tribes to devise their own way and their own plan of attack to take out their own targets. Pontiac had targeted 13 different British forts. The forts were obviously something like we just saw up here with Fort Detroit, but the forts also consisted of blockhouses, which would have been kind of like a little mini fort. These blockhouses and the forts basically ranged all the way from Lake Michigan back to the Monongahela and the Allegheny Rivers. So the attack was over a vast amount of country. It wasn't simultaneously, as we will see here in a bit. It all kind of happened over the course of a few weeks and over the course of a month. But back then, there was no communication that could actually go from one end of the country to the other in less than a week or 2 weeks. So what was happening out by Lake Michigan was not discovered by the British, and what was going on more to the east for weeks and weeks and weeks. It took that long for the communication to have actually taken place. But the attacks were brilliant, and all but 5 of the British forts and blockhouses were captured. There were frontier settlements that were plundered and laid to absolute desolate waste. When the tribes went in and they attacked, they left nothing alive. Just about every colonial citizen in all of these settlements were killed, or they just disappeared. Nobody ever saw those citizens again. And I'll give you an estimate a little bit later as to how many people actually died in this uprising. On May 16th of 1763, Fort Sandusky was the first British blockhouse, the first fort to be captured and totally destroyed. And you want to guess who it was that enacted the first defeat for the British? At Fort Sandusky, it was our grandmas and grandpas. In 1761, the British had built a blockhouse at Lower Sandusky, not Upper Sandusky, but down at Lower Sandusky. And our grandmas and grandpas basically said that they would ceremoniously burn it to the ground. They opposed the British building that blockhouse. They really didn't have the ability to stop it at that time. But they said at some point in the coming years that they would absolutely destroy and burn that blockhouse to the ground. They did so on May 16th. The blockhouse commander was taken hostage, and the commander had with him inside the blockhouse 15 soldiers, 15 regular British soldiers. Every single one of them were killed. Along with the soldiers that were killed and the commander that was taken hostage, there were a number of British traders that were in and around the blockhouse. Every single one of the traders that were there were killed. They weren't just killed, they were killed in a brutal kind of a way. And as promised, the blockhouse was burnt down to nothing but charcoal. And this next quote, it's a pretty good sized quote, is taken from Parkman's Conspiracy of Pontiac. And Parkman basically described what we did, what our grandmas and grandpas did in order to completely destroy all the people that were inside the blockhouse, especially what they did here to the traders. And if you can recall from previous months where we talked about some of the talents that our grandmas and grandpas had, they had a really good talent in duplicity. They would do one thing while at the same time on the backside they did another. And this is another example of that. They basically walked up to, we'll take the time to read it, we'll just paraphrase what they did, but they basically walked up to all the traders that were there at Sandusky, inside and outside of the blockhouse, and they said, hey, we got some bad people coming. If you will be our prisoners, we will protect you. And they were so good at basically compelling the traders to become their prisoners that the traders actually let them tie their hands. They took their arms, they took their rifles, they took their knives, they took their tomahawks, they tied their hands up as though they were in bondage, and they gave everything to our grandmas and grandpas because they trusted them. The problem was when their hands were bound and all their weapons had been confiscated, our grandmas and grandpas absolutely hacked them to pieces. They turned on them. They were going to get the British out of Wyandotte land at whatever the cost was. And this kind of set the tone for the wars that followed. When our grandmas and grandpas went in and they actually took a fort, or they took lives on a battlefield, it was a little bit difficult for a lot of the people out there to know which nation had scalped. Our grandmas and grandpas were known for not just scalping, but they took the whole head of the person that they killed. They wanted to make it clear that it was the Wyandotte that walked in and did whatever it was that the British or the other nations found. They left their mark, and they left it in a brutal but very convincing kind of a way. So this kind of set the tone for the wars that was going to follow. On May 25th, the Potawatomi captured Fort St. Joseph. 15 were killed, 1 was taken hostage. And it just goes on and on. Fort after fort after fort, blockhouse was captured. From May 25th all the way up to June 19th, the different nations that had allied with Pontiac basically completed their mission. Not one failed. On June 19th, and this is something that is a little bit different with any of the wars that had taken place thus far in the Ohio country. Most of the wars that had taken place outside of the Iroquois, when they went and attacked, most of the wars and the skirmishes that took place was done by a small group of warriors. But on June 19th, the Wyandotte, our grandmas and grandpas, kind of set the tone for what would be the coming war with the British and eventually the Americans. But we organized an army. We took with us Ottawa, Ojibwa, and Seneca warriors, 250 in total, and laid siege, ultimately killing 300, or not 300, but 30 to 60 of the soldiers that were inside Fort Presque Isle. And that had never been done before up to this time. There had not been an organized army of Indians that went and laid siege to a village or a fort. So June 19th was a big day. It was kind of a turning point in which war was being waged in the Ohio country. The British, they held up to their own reputation. In June, the Delaware and Shawnee laid siege to Fort Pitt. And we're going to have some of our people who are currently driving across Ohio in Fort Pitt in a few days. And the British did something there that was unconventional. They actually participated in warfare, germ warfare, because during a little delegation that was being entertained by the British gave to the Delaware delegation 2 smallpox-infested blankets. They also gave as a gift to one of the chiefs a kerchief that was infested with smallpox. The British were concerned that the Delaware and Shawnee could actually take Fort Pitt. And inside of Fort Pitt, there was a little outbreak of smallpox. And if the British stayed inside the fort, they were afraid they were all going to die. So they gave the Delaware a gift of smallpox to take back to their own village and their own people. And it is unknown how many of the Delaware actually died from that gift that the British gave to the Delaware. History tries to hide the fact that the British actually invested in germ warfare. We actually have an oral tradition that speaks of it, even though history tries to hide the fact that they were giving smallpox as gifts to the different tribes. History states pretty clear that no matter how much they try and hide it, it actually happened. So the carnage was pretty brutal. It's estimated that during the 3-year uprising, only about 200 of the different nations, the warriors, had died. The number of civilians within the nations, it's unknown how many of them died. British soldiers, it's estimated that 450 regular British soldiers were killed. Colonial civilians, it's estimated up to 2,000 had been killed by the different tribes. The number of displaced colonials, those that were basically out beyond the king's proclamation as to where they could go, they were displaced back over into the colonies to the number of at least 4,000. So there was quite a bit of death that took place over the course of the 3 years that the war raged. But before the war came to an end in spring of 1764, the British sent 2 armies. One went into Pennsylvania and the Ohio country. The one started marching out west toward the Great Lakes and ended up at the Mississippi River. And they were out there looking for the tribes. They were looking for the warriors. And a quote from on the back of a turtle basically is, finding the tribes, if they did not want to be found, would be like trying to find a porcupine quill in a forest of pine needles. The British went out west with this army that they had been accustomed to fighting in Europe, thinking that they were going to find the Indian armies and they were going to go to battle with them. But when the British actually got out west and they tried to look for the warriors, they couldn't find them. They couldn't find one nation. They couldn't find one warrior. It was literally trying to find that one porcupine quill in a forest of pine needles. The Indians were masters of the forest, and the British were at their mercy. The Delaware and the Shawnee were the first of the tribes to seek peace. They stood basically toe-to-toe with the British on British controlled land, even though it wasn't completely legal. The British did some damage to the Shawnee. They pushed them back out into the Ohio country, into Ohio, where we eventually gave them land. So the Delaware and the Shawnee were in Ohio, basically as our guests in coming years. The Potawatomi and then the Huron faction under Tieta were the next to seek for peace. After 3 years of fighting, the tribes, they lost interest. There was not a whole lot that was going on after the first year. It was kind of a standstill. And by the fall of 1764, Pontiac's uprising had basically sputtered out. The loss of life, the killing, the taking of the forts, all of that had ended, but Pontiac didn't want to quit the fight. He did not agree to peace until July of 1766. Technically, the uprising ended in a stalemate. The Indians did not win. The British didn't win. Nobody won the war. They basically came to an agreement that it was time to quit. And the one thing that was kind of a positive influence is that the uprising did change British policies with the Indians. There was such a noted change that took place with the British and their relationship with the different tribes that we'll see in about 10 years that relationship changed to the point that what was friends or what became enemies became friends and allies. Pontiac self-exiled himself to the Illinois country. And in April of 1769, he was assassinated. He was assassinated by a citizen of the Kaskaskia tribe. They are one of the Illinois tribes. They're related to the, now in Northeast Oklahoma, the Peoria. They are a relative of the Peoria tribe. And one of their citizens got drunk and he got bribed to go kill the great Ottawa chief, all for a barrel of whiskey. So he took the bribe, he went with his drunkenness and his prized barrel of whiskey, and he killed Pontiac. Killed him with the tomahawk, split his head wide open. But unfortunately for that gentleman there and his people, his nation, when I say his people, it wasn't just his tribe, it was all of the related Illinois tribes. in retaliation and in vengeance, all the tribes that had lined, or most of the tribes that had lined and followed Pontiac into war, they rose up and they sought vengeance for his death and nearly exterminated all of the Illinois tribes. Those tribes that survived basically ended up unifying, and they became, for the most part, the Peoria that are in Northeast Oklahoma today. The Indians, they fought among themselves. The British, they began to fight among themselves in the colonies. The colonists became defiant and embattled. They began to leak themselves out of the colonies. They went into the Ohio country, which began to inflame the Indians. All the different nations there were like, you can't do that. So the colonial Americans began to talk and seek independence from the British crown. And this eventually became a major distraction for the British Army, which took a lot of the attention away from the various tribes in the Ohio country and out west, as the British began to focus their attention upon the secessionists, the citizens of the crown that were basically rebelling. The relationship between the British and the various tribes improved, but it never reached the level that the French once enjoyed with the tribes. The Indians, who had fought this horribly vicious war against the British, eventually became allies of the British in their war against the colonials. It's hard to imagine, but the British were the lesser of the two evils, which says quite a bit about what the Americans would do in coming years. The Wyandotte tribe, after the Ottawa basically slipped off into oblivion, became the undisputed and the most powerful leader of the Indian Alliance. The Ottawa had been pretty much the defiant nation up to that point. Now the torch was passed, if you will, to our grandmas and grandpas. The leader of the alliance was basically bestowed the title of half king. And one of the things that the half king, the title of half king, basically brought was a responsibility of accountability to the Haudenosaunee. It was the Haudenosaunee who put together this ploy of the half king. They wanted somebody to go out to the west and basically be their eyes and their spies on the other nations. So they found the most powerful chief of whatever nation that was then the most powerful. They granted him this title of half king. He had title, he had honor, he had authority, he had responsibilities, but he had that accountability that he always had to pursue the Haudenosaunee policies that were important to them at that time. Unfortunately, for this appointed chief to be half king, he was only half king, but the king in England could be only the full king. So he was just a kind of a figurative king. He was half king. And by this time, 1763, 1766, the Haudenosaunee authority had been pretty much negated. They no longer had any control of the tribes out in the Ohio country, but this title that they had formed back in the early 1700s stuck. And what was the name of the Huron-Wyandotte chief? What was the name of our chief that was given the title of half king by the Haudenosaunee? Does anybody know his name? Domquat. Domquat was given the title of half king. Domquat was Huron-Wyandotte. Domquat was the most powerful chief that lived during the time shortly after Pontiac's uprising. Domquat was an absolutely amazing man. He unified all the tribes together. He fought in the Ohio country with the British as his ally, and he literally defeated the colonial Americans at the Ohio River. The colonial Americans did not cross the Ohio River underneath his time of being the leader. And if you go and you look through the history books for Domquat, it's hard to find him because he is commonly referred to as just the half king. And he is also commonly referred to in history as Pomoacan. The name Pomoacan is the name that was given to him by the Delaware tribe. So if you go and look him up, you have to look up Dongquat, you have to look up Pamoakan, and you have to look up Half King. He's known by all three names. The three names are one and the same. When you see Dongquat, you can also come across another name that's very similar to Dongquat, Dionquat. So Dionquat was Tarhe's predecessor, and you cannot confuse him with Tarhe's successor. The two names are very similar, but they are two different chiefs at two different times, with Tarhe stuck in the middle of both of them. Dionquat is the chief that was basically in Ohio at the time that the Methodists first walked into Upper Sandusky and began to spread Methodism. So Dongquat was the grandson of who? We have talked about another chief over the course of the last few months. Who is the grandfather of Dongquat? Would anybody like to take a guess as to who Dongquat's grandfather is? And it might put in perspective a little bit as to the power and the authority and the wildness, the magnificence Dongquat had at the time. Who was Dongquat's grandfather? Nicholas Ornte. Nicholas, who was the first to try and rebel against the French back in 1760 or 1750, what was it, 54? I can't even remember. But Dionquat is the grandson of Chief Nicholas. So the wildness that Nicholas had was carried through his bloodline, through his father, down to his grandson. And Dionquat, we'll touch a little bit next week on some of the things that he did as we transition into the next quarter of our discussion, which next week we're going to focus the majority of our time on Chief Tarhe. That with Chief Tarhe begins a whole new era, a whole new quarter in the history of our people and our relationship with what was going on at that time, the Americans in the Ohio country. And as usual, there's all the sources, and that's all. Any questions, thoughts, or ideas? Okay, so next month, actually this month, it's next week. 1 week from today, I believe it's the last Tuesday of the month, we get to talk about Tarhe. Everybody should be familiar with Tarhe. Tarhe was, he was again, another amazing chief that we had. So Kim, if there's no questions or anything, I think we're done. And that was a lot.
That was great, Lloyd. Thank you so much. Let me stop the recording.